The stars shimmered through the viewing glass as Commander Zik stood on the bridge of his ship. His three eyes focused on the blue planet spinning below. The stellar dawn had been traveling through space for 6 months, mapping new worlds and recording data. This planet looked ordinary at first. Water covered most of it. Green and brown lands spread across the surface. White clouds drifted in patterns. Nothing seemed unusual until the sensors started beeping. Vex, the ship's navigator, touched the controls with his long tentacles. His face showed confusion. The screens displayed numbers that made no sense. He checked the readings 3 times before speaking. "Commander Zix, we have a problem. The instruments show life forms in the northern regions, but the temperature readings are wrong. They must be broken." Zix walked closer to the screen. "Show me." The image changed to display a landscape covered in white frozen water. The numbers appeared at the bottom. -40 degrees. Wind speeds at 100 units. The commander felt his breathing slow. That is not possible. Nothing lives in those conditions. The scientist Dr. Kalla entered the bridge. She moved her forearms in concern as she studied the data. "Sir, I have confirmed the readings. They are accurate. There are settlements down there. Beings are living in that frozen zone. Our environmental suits would fail in 6 hours in those conditions. Our soldiers would die in less than 1 day." Zix did not believe what he heard. "Scan for technology. They must have heating systems, force fields, something that protects them." Vex worked the controls for several minutes. His tentacles moved faster as he searched. "Commander, there is no advanced technology. I detect only fire." Simple fire made from burning wood. "And they wear clothes made from animal skins." The bridge fell silent. Every member of the crew knew what this meant. A species surviving deadly cold with only primitive tools. It went against everything they knew about life and survival. Dr. Kalla spoke quietly. "Commander, I request permission to study this more closely. This could change our understanding of biological limits." Zix nodded slowly. "Prepare a landing team. I want to see this with my own eyes. But be careful. If they can survive in that cold, they might be more dangerous than we think." Within 2 hours, the team gathered in the transport bay. They wore thick environmental suits designed for the worst conditions. The suits hummed with power as heating systems activated. The transport descended through the atmosphere. Ice crystals formed on the windows. The temperature displays dropped lower and lower. When they landed near a canyon, the doors opened to reveal a world of white and gray. Snow covered everything. Wind howled across the rocks. The cold tried to push through their suits immediately. Vex checked his instruments. Temperature is -38. With the wind, it feels like -52. At these levels, exposed skin would freeze in 3 minutes. Cell damage would occur in 10 minutes. Death would follow in less than 30 minutes. He looked up at the settlement ahead. Yet they live here. The structures ahead look simple. Animal skin stretched over wooden frames. Smoke rose from several fires. As they approached, a figure emerged from one of the dwellings. He was tall, with dark hair that hung past his shoulders. His skin had a copper tone. He wore layers of furs and leather wrappings. His eyes watched them with calm intelligence. The universal translator attached to Zix's suit clicked on. "Greetings. We come in peace from the stars. We wish to learn about your people." The human looked at them for a long moment. His breath made small clouds in the frozen air. He did not seem afraid or surprised. Finally, he spoke. "I am Daniel. You should come inside. You are not dressed for this weather." Dr. Kalla's suit beeped a warning. "Commander, our heating systems are already working at 70% capacity. We have been outside for less than 5 minutes." Zix looked at Daniel standing in the cold. The human wore no technology, no heating devices, just animal skins, yet he showed no signs of distress. They followed Daniel into the dwelling. Inside, a fire burned in a pit at the center. The smoke traveled up and out through a hole at the top. More animal skins lined the walls. The temperature felt warmer, but still cold enough to be dangerous. Daniel gestured for them to sit. A younger woman entered carrying wooden cups filled with steaming liquid. "This is my daughter, Kate." The woman smiled and handed each visitor a cup. "It is pine needle tea. It will help warm you." Zix took the cup through his suit's access port. The liquid was hot. He sipped it carefully. Heat spread through his body. It helped, but his suit still worked hard to keep him alive. Daniel sat across from them. "You want to know how we survive the winter?" Zix nodded. Our instruments say this environment should kill any living thing. Yet you and your people live here as if it is normal. Daniel's face showed a small smile. It is normal. This is our home. We have lived in places like this for more generations than I can count. But how? Dr. Kalla leaned forward. You have no technology. No heating systems. How do your bodies not freeze? Daniel looked at the fire. We learn. My grandfather taught me. His grandfather taught him. We learn to read the land. We learn which animals have the warmest fur. We learn how to layer our clothes to trap air. We learn to keep moving to stay warm. We learn when to seek shelter and when we can travel. Kate added more wood to the fire. The winter teaches you. If you do not learn, you die. But if you pay attention, if you respect the cold, you can live. Our children learn these skills from the time they can walk. It becomes part of who we are. Vex's tentacles twitched. But your biology. How does your body handle the extreme cold? Daniel held up his hands. We feel the cold like you do. It hurts. It can kill us if we are not careful. But we know the signs. We know when our fingers start to go numb. We know when to warm them. We know how much our bodies can take. And we know how to push through when we have to. He pointed to food hanging from poles near the ceiling. We prepare. We store food. We gather firewood. We make sure we have everything we need before the worst storms come. Six looked around the dwelling. Everything here had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. The positioning of the fire, the angle of the walls, the way the smoke escaped. It was all carefully designed through years of experience. This is incredible. Your people have mastered survival without any of the tools we consider necessary. Daniel shook his head. We have not mastered anything. The winter is always stronger than we are. We just learned to live with it instead of fighting it. There is a difference. Kate brought them more tea. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Snow began to fall. Zix realized his suit was now working at 90% capacity. They had been inside for less than an hour. Commander, we should return to the ship soon. Our suits cannot maintain this level of power consumption for long. Zix looked at Daniel and Kate sitting comfortably by the fire. These humans needed no suits, no technology, just knowledge and skill passed down through generations. It seemed impossible. Yet here they were, living proof that it could be done. Before we go, I must ask, has anyone ever tried to make you leave this place? To move you somewhere warmer? Daniel's expression darkened. Yes, many times. People with guns and soldiers. They said this land was not ours. They tried to force us to reservations, to places where the land was different. Some of our people went. Many died there, not from cold but from being away from home. Others ran. They came back to the mountains and canyons. Back to the winter, why? Zix asked. Why risk death to return to such a harsh place? Daniel looked into the fire. Because this is who we are. The land made us strong. The winter made us wise. Take that away and we are nothing. Some things are worth dying for. Freedom is one of them. The words hung in the air. Zix understood then that these humans were not just physically adapted to their environment. They were mentally and spiritually connected to it. The harsh land had shaped not just their survival skills, but their entire way of thinking. As the landing team prepared to leave, Kate gave them each a small bundle. Food for your journey. Dried meat and fat mixed with berries. It will give you energy. They stepped back into the brutal cold. The wind had picked up. Snow swirled around them. Zix looked back to see Daniel and Kate standing in the entrance of their dwelling. Neither wore anything on their heads. The snow landed on their hair and shoulders. They raised their hands in farewell. Then they turned and went back inside to their fire and their home. The journey back to the transport took only minutes but felt longer. Zix's suit alarms beeped constantly. They were all reaching critical levels. When the transport doors closed behind them, the entire team collapsed onto the benches. The ship's warmth felt like paradise. Dr. Kalla removed her helmet. Her face showed exhaustion. We were out there for less than 2 hours total, and we nearly depleted our suits. Those humans live there every day. Back on the stellar dawn, Zix stood before the viewing screen again. The planet turned below. He thought about Daniel and Kate in their canyon. He thought about the strength it took to survive each day. Not the strength of muscles or weapons, but the strength of knowledge and will. These humans were not primitive. They were something else entirely. Something his people needed to understand. Because if humans could survive the impossible with nothing but learned skills and determination, what could they do once they had technology? The thought both excited and terrified him. The alien ship came down through clouds thick with ice and snow, its metal hull shaking as the wind tried to push it away from the frozen plateau below. Commander Zalthor watched the temperature readings drop lower and lower, numbers that meant death for most living things in the galaxy. His crew shifted nervously in their seats, mandibles clicking with worry as the ship descended through the storm. When they finally landed, the wind hit them like a physical blow. Even through their advanced environmental suits designed to protect them on 100 different worlds, Zalthor felt the brutal cold trying to find a way inside. Snow whipped across the plateau so thick he could barely see 10 meters ahead. His suit computer flashed warnings about wind chill and exposure times. According to the data, no unprotected biological life should exist in these conditions. Yet the thermal sensors showed life signs ahead. A cluster of warm bodies moving around in what appeared to be some kind of settlement. Zalthor led his team forward, each step a struggle against wind that wanted to knock them down and bury them in snow. His science officer Dalvin kept checking his instruments as if they must be broken, because the readings made no sense at all. A human appeared out of the white chaos like a ghost. He wore layers of animal hide and woven cloth, primitive by any galactic standard. Yet he walked with easy confidence through conditions that had Zalthor's military-grade suit screaming alarms. The human was older, his face weathered and dark, his eyes calm as he looked at the aliens without fear or surprise. The man raised one hand in greeting and spoke in the dominant language of this planet, which Zalthor's translator quickly processed. He introduced himself as John Whitefeather, and said something about this being a terrible time to visit. Then he invited them to follow him to shelter before the storm got worse, as if it could possibly get worse than this nightmare of wind and ice. Zalthor wanted to refuse, wanted to return to his ship where climate controls kept everything comfortable and safe. But Dalvin was already following the human, scientific curiosity overriding common sense. Krental, their security officer, stayed close to Zalthor as they trudged through snow that came up to their knees. The camp emerged from the storm gradually, a collection of cone-shaped structures made from wooden poles and animal hides. Smoke rose from openings at the tops, defying the wind. More humans moved among the shelters, adults and children going about tasks as if deadly cold was just a minor inconvenience. Small ones played in the snow, their laughter bright and clear. Women carried bundles of wood that should have required mechanical assistance. Men worked on tools and weapons with bare hands that should have been frozen solid. John led them into a larger shelter at the center of the camp. Inside, the temperature was surprisingly comfortable. A fire burned in a central pit, its smoke venting up through a carefully designed hole in the roof. Dried meat hung from racks alongside roots and berries. Furs covered the ground and walls. Everything was organized with ruthless efficiency, the kind that came from knowing that wasted effort meant death. An elderly woman sat near the fire, working leather with a bone tool. She looked up at the aliens with interest but no alarm, as if visitors from space were no stranger than visitors from the next valley. She introduced herself as Grace Blackbird and made a comment about stories her grandmother told of star people, never thinking she would live to see such things herself. Dalvin immediately began asking questions about the camp, the people, their survival methods. Grace answered patiently while her hands never stopped working. She explained there were 43 people here, mostly families living through their second winter on this plateau. That was when Dalvin pulled up the historical records. 3 years ago, this region had experienced what humans called the Winter of Death. The southern nation had sent 200 soldiers to establish a military presence here. The soldiers had advanced cold weather gear, supplies for months, and military training. Within 6 weeks, all of them were dead. Frozen corpses found in their tents in the snow, scattered across the plateau like broken toys. Zalthor turned to John, his translator struggling to convey his shock. How had 43 civilians survived where 200 trained soldiers had died? John's answer was simple and devastating. The soldiers hadn't been warriors, just men following orders, wearing uniforms that looked impressive but couldn't handle real winter. They hadn't listened to the land, hadn't respected what they faced, and the land had killed them for their arrogance. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind screamed across the plateau with a sound like tortured souls. Zalthor's suit registered wind speeds that would tear apart most temporary structures, temperatures that would freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. Yet the shelter held firm, barely shaking, and the humans continued their activities as if nothing unusual was happening. A young girl brought Zalthor a bowl of stew, telling him her grandmother said he needed to eat, that sitting still too long was how cold got inside you. The girl, Lucy Whitehorse, couldn't have been more than 8 years old, yet she moved with the confidence of someone who knew her place and purpose. She asked if he could really breathe in space, listened to his answer with serious attention, then scampered off to help with other tasks. More humans introduced themselves throughout the evening. Mary Strongheart, who was processing animal hides with techniques that looked primitive but proved to be remarkably sophisticated. Paul Redhawk, who explained how they had secured the horses against the storm. Daniel Morningstar, quiet and thoughtful, who made tools with patient precision. Children and elders, each with their role, each contributing to the collective survival. As night fell, the whole camp gathered for a meal. Everyone sat together, sharing food and warmth. There was no rigid hierarchy like in a military unit, but rather an organic structure where everyone mattered. Everyone contributed. After eating, Paul brought out a stringed instrument and began to play. Others joined with voices, singing in a language older than the dominant tongue of this world, songs that carried the weight of generations. Grace explained these were the old songs, the ones that reminded them who they were and where they came from. They told stories of ancestors who survived impossible things, proof that humans were made of tougher stuff than the universe expected. When you were in the middle of winter, she said, those stories mattered more than any technology. The Krillians settled in for the night, surrounded by humans who treated lethal conditions as merely inconvenient. Zalthor sent a report to his ship, assuring them the landing party was safe but unable to return until the weather cleared. The response was skeptical, asking how primitive shelters could possibly provide better protection than their advanced vessel. Zalthor looked around the warm shelter, at humans sleeping peacefully while the storm raged outside, at children dreaming without fear, at elders keeping watch with calm assurance. He had no answer that would satisfy headquarters, because the truth was something that had to be experienced to be believed. These humans were rewriting everything the Galactic Survey Corps thought they knew about survival, adaptation, and the limits of biological resilience. The second day of the storm dawned gray and violent, though dawn was barely distinguishable from the night that preceded it. Commander Zalthor had barely slept, his mind too active processing everything he observed. The humans woke with the practiced efficiency of people who couldn't afford to waste daylight. Even diffused daylight filtered through storm clouds and blowing snow. Young Lucy appeared beside him again, this time with a wooden cup of something hot and bitter. She explained it was tea made from pine needles that had helped keep sickness away during winter. Zalthor accepted it carefully, tasted it, found it astringent but not unpleasant. The girl watched to make sure he drank it, then nodded with satisfaction and moved on to her next task. Dalvin was already awake and observing, his recording equipment capturing every detail. He had spent the night analyzing the shelter's construction and was clearly impressed. The design was far more sophisticated than it appeared, with every pole positioned to distribute stress, every hide layered to provide insulation while allowing moisture to escape. It was engineering without machines, architecture born from generations of trial and error and hard-won knowledge. Mary Strongheart noticed Dalvin's attention and invited him to watch her work. She was scraping an elk hide, removing tissue with a curved stone blade. Her movements were rhythmic and sure, the result of thousands of hours of practice. She explained that the elk had given its life 3 weeks ago, that they honored that sacrifice by using every part, hide for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread, bones for tools, even hooves boiled down for glue. Dalvin asked why they didn't use machines to process the hides faster. Mary's answer was enlightening. Speed wasn't the only measure of efficiency. Everything they made had to work when temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. Machines broke down, needed parts they couldn't make or replace. But knowledge, skill, understanding of materials, those things never broke. Those things could be passed down through generations without requiring supply chains or manufacturing facilities. Across the shelter, John Whitefeather was teaching Krental about fire management. The Krillian security officer, trained in survival across multiple environment types, found himself learning basic concepts he had never considered. Different woods burned at different rates and temperatures. Hardwood like oak burned slow and hot, good for overnight fires that kept coals until morning. Softwood like pine burned fast and bright, good for quick heat or starting fires. You mixed them based on your needs, adjusted throughout the day and night. John explained that humans weren't adapted to cold. They were adaptable. That was different and more important. Humans lived in deserts where heat killed, jungles where moisture rotted everything, mountains where air barely held enough oxygen to breathe. They weren't built for any specific environment. They were built to figure out any environment. That adaptability was their true strength. The storm outside continued without mercy, but inside the shelter life went on with calm normalcy. Children received lessons from elders, learning not just facts but wisdom. Kate Strongheart, Mary's daughter, taught Lucy about different types of wood, explaining their properties and uses with the expertise of someone much older. The girls were 9 and 8, but they spoke about fire management with professional competence. Daniel Morningstar was teaching Krental to read animal tracks, explaining how deer walked versus elk versus predators. Krental asked why this mattered when they had stored food. Daniel's answer was patient. Winter was long and stores could run out. Knowing where game moved and how they behaved was the difference between eating and starving. Plus, you needed to know what predators were around, because a mountain lion didn't care that you were intelligent. It just knew you were meat. This led to a story about a big cat that had started hanging around the camp 3 winters back. Paul and Daniel had tracked it for 2 days, made sure it understood they were dangerous. Eventually it moved on. They could have killed it, Daniel said, but the cat was just trying to survive same as them, and there was no shame in that. Grace Blackbird gathered the children for stories, and Dalvin joined them eagerly. Grace spoke in the old language, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that held the children transfixed. Lucy translated in whispers for the aliens. The story was about the winter of frozen stars, when cold came so hard the night sky seemed to freeze. People wanted to flee south, but elders said no. This was the test that would define them. The story told of hunters going out and finding nothing, game having fled deep into forests. Then the youngest hunter, barely more than a boy, followed his dreams and a white raven into deep snow. He found a sheltered valley where elk had gathered. Instead of hunting immediately, he brought the people there and they made camp where the elk could see them. They watched and learned the elk's patterns. When they finally hunted, they took only what they needed, and the rest of the elk stayed, providing food all winter. Dalvin asked if the story was true. Grace smiled and said truth was complicated after enough time passed. But the lesson was true and the valley was real and they still used it. The principle of respecting what sustained you had kept them alive longer than anyone could count. Paul Redhawk worked with his son Billy on crafting a bow, the process meticulous and patient. Paul explained that a bow was more than a weapon. It was a tool that extended capability but only as good as the person using it. You needed strength but also patience, focus, respect. Billy asked when he would be ready to hunt. Paul said when he understood that hunting wasn't about killing, but about relationship. That the animal gave its life so you could live. That this was sacred, honored by making death quick and clean, by using everything, by never taking more than needed. As evening approached, the storm reached its peak. Even the humans acknowledged this one was severe by their standards, which meant apocalyptic by any reasonable measure. Wind hit the shelter hard enough that walls visibly flexed. The Krillians tensed, hands moving toward useless weapons. The humans didn't even pause in their activities. Mary sat down beside Dalvin during a quiet moment and told him he was looking at them wrong. He saw individuals and measured individual capability, but humans didn't survive as individuals. They survived as a people. Grace's wisdom, John's leadership, Paul's skills, Daniel's knowledge, even Lucy's joy that kept spirits up, all of it together made them strong enough. The soldiers who died had been trained to be independent, self-reliant, every man for himself. These people were trained that they were only as strong as the weakest among them, that everyone's survival depended on everyone else. That collective survival strategy multiplied individual strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. It was elegant, sophisticated, and developed by people most galactic civilizations would dismiss as primitive. The third day brought the storm's full fury, and even the humans treated it with increased respect. Commander Zalthor watched through a gap in the shelter as wind-driven snow created a white void where visibility dropped to absolute zero. The world outside was erased, replaced by howling chaos. John Whitefeather stood beside him, looking out at the whiteout conditions. "This was what killed the soldiers," he said quietly. "Not the cold alone, but this. The complete disorientation, the terror of being unable to see your hand in front of your face." The soldiers had panicked, left their shelters, got separated from each other. By the time they realized their mistake, the cold had already won and they died scattered across the plateau, alone and confused. Grace Blackbird spoke from her place by the fire without looking up from her work. Fear had killed those men as surely as cold. Fear that the storm would never end, that supplies would run out, that shelter would collapse. Fear made people stupid, made them think movement equaled action, that doing something was always better than doing nothing. But sometimes survival meant sitting still and waiting, and patience was a weapon against winter. Zalthor found this concept difficult. His training emphasized action, initiative, aggressive problem-solving. The idea that the correct response to danger might be calm inaction went against every instinct his military career had built. Yet here were these humans, demonstrating that sometimes the hardest and bravest thing was to simply endure. Lucy was teaching Krental a string game, looping cord around their fingers in complex patterns. The Krillian warrior, trained in dozens of combat forms, struggled with the simple human game. Lucy giggled and told him he was thinking too hard, that he should feel the string, that it wanted to move certain ways. Krental protested that string didn't want anything. It was non-sentient material. Lucy's response was pure childhood wisdom. Maybe, but everything had a nature. Wood wanted to grow, stone wanted to stay still, water wanted to flow. If you worked with what things wanted to do, life was easier. A massive gust hit the shelter hard enough to make the walls bow inward. The Krillians tensed, adrenaline spiking. The humans didn't even glance up. Mary continued teaching Kate how to splice rope. Paul kept working on a spear shaft, testing its balance. Daniel shaped a knife handle with careful attention. Zalthor asked if the structure would hold. Paul answered without concern. He had built it himself along with John and Daniel. They had ridden out worse storms. The key was flexibility. Too rigid and wind tore you apart. The shelter breathed with the storm, gave a little, then sprang back. It was a philosophy that extended beyond architecture to their entire approach to survival. A loud crack made all three Krillians jump, hands reaching for weapons. The humans looked up, assessed, then returned to their work. John explained it was an ice branch, that trees couldn't always handle the weight when ice built up. Branches broke, sometimes whole trees came down. It was loud, but unless you were standing under it, no danger. Krental asked how they could tell the difference between dangerous sounds and harmless ones. John's answer revealed yet another layer of their environmental awareness. Different cracks meant different things. Sharp and sudden meant ice breaking. Long and groaning meant trees giving way under weight. Thunder-like meant avalanche, but they weren't positioned anywhere that threatened them. They lived in constant conversation with their environment, reading signs invisible to most civilized species. Night fell, though the storm made it hard to distinguish day from darkness. The humans settled into sleep routines, families clustering for warmth. They showed no concern about the aliens observing them vulnerable, a trust that was oddly touching. Grace stayed awake longer, her old hands still working on a moccasin she was crafting. Zalthor sat with her, finding her presence calming. She asked if he couldn't sleep. He explained his species required less sleep than humans, that he found himself thinking about what he had observed. Grace asked what he had observed. He spoke of strength he didn't expect, resilience that didn't match their data about human physiology, social bonds that generated survival capability beyond individual capacity. Grace smiled and said those were fancy words for saying they took care of each other. Zalthor insisted it was more than that every species they encountered developed technology to overcome environmental challenges. But these humans had chosen to develop themselves instead. Grace corrected him gently. They hadn't chosen it exactly. Their ancestors had been forced to this land, told it was all they could have, that the dominant nations wanted good land for themselves, and figured winter would kill these people or drive them away. They had been wrong. These people learned to love winter, to see its gifts instead of just its dangers. Being underestimated turned out to be a good survival strategy. The soldiers who died had technology and equipment, Zalthor said. What did they lack? Grace answered immediately. Humility. They came thinking they had conquered winter with uniforms and supplies, didn't listen when old-timers told them what they faced. Pride killed faster than cold sometimes. She looked directly at Zalthor with eyes that had seen too many winters to count. The Krillians came in suits and ships with knowledge of 300 worlds, but they were sitting in a hide tent eating elk stew, learning that fancy equipment didn't have all the answers. That was wisdom, and it might keep them alive when the universe threw something unexpected at them. The storm howled, a monster that had proven lethal to trained forces. Yet inside the shelter, surrounded by humans who treated apocalyptic weather as inconvenience, Zalthor felt safer than in his own ship. Somewhere in the database, Earth humans were listed as moderately adaptable, comfortable in temperate zones, capable of basic tool use. That entry needed major revision. These humans had turned winter into a crucible that refined them into something extraordinary. The fourth morning brought subtle changes only the humans noticed. The wind still howled, but with less fury. The snow still fell, but less horizontally. John Whitefeather studied the way flakes filtered through gaps in the shelter and announced the storm was breaking up, that they would have clear skies by tomorrow morning. Dalvin checked his instruments, which confirmed what John had intuited from simple observation. The science officer's amazement was evident even through his alien features. Sensors barely detected the pressure change that John read instinctively. Mary Strongheart laughed at his surprise. Sensors, she said, humans were sensors. Every part of them read the world. You felt it in bones, and how skin tingled, and how deep you breathed. The land talked if you listened. With the storm's end approaching, humans began preparing for what came after. Not frantically, but with practiced efficiency that reminded Zalthor of military preparations, yet without rigid hierarchy. Tools were checked, supplies inventoried, plans discussed. Everyone knew their role without being told. Kate Strongheart was teaching Lucy about different wood types, the girls working with serious concentration that belied their young ages. Kate held up pine, soft enough to dig a nail into, explaining it burned fast with lots of light but didn't last, good for starting fires or quick heat. Then oak, hard and heavy, burning slow. Her father said oak was like patience, took forever to catch, but once going would keep you warm all night. These girls were 9 and 8, speaking about fire management with expertise that would require years of training in any galactic facility. More importantly, they understood why behind the what, not just memorizing facts but comprehending principles. Krental was learning from Daniel Morningstar about reading animal tracks in snow. Deer walked light-footed and efficient, 2 prints together, then a gap. Elk were heavier with deeper prints, more deliberate. Predators walked different, more spread out, testing ground. Krental asked why this mattered when they had stored food. Daniel's answer was patient. Now they had food, but winter was long and stores could run out. Knowing where game moved, how they behaved, that was the difference between eating and starving when supplies got low. Plus, you needed to know what predators were around. Mountain lions didn't care that you were intelligent, they just knew you were meat. 3 winters back, Daniel said, a big cat started hanging around camp. Big male, probably desperate. He and Paul tracked it for 2 days, made sure it knew they were dangerous. Eventually it moved on. Killing would have been easier, but that cat was just trying to survive same as them, and there was no shame in that. Grace Blackbird called the younger children together, inviting Dalvin to listen. She began telling old stories in the ancient language, her voice taking rhythmic quality. Lucy translated in whispers. The story was about the winter of frozen stars, when cold came so hard the night sky seemed to freeze. People were hungry and scared, many wanting to leave south where it was warmer, but elders said no. This was the test that would define them. The strongest warriors went to hunt, but game had fled deep into forests. Days passed with no food. Then the youngest hunter, barely more than a boy, listened to dreams and followed a white raven into deep snow. Others said he was foolish, but he found a valley sheltered from wind where elk had gathered. He didn't hunt them immediately. He came back, led the people there. They made camp where elk could see them. Dalvin asked why not hunt immediately. Grace switched to common language to answer. Patience. They watched elk, learned their patterns. When they finally hunted, they took only what was needed. The rest of the elk stayed and the people had food all winter. The valley became sacred, a reminder that survival wasn't about taking everything but about balance. Zalthor asked if this was true history. Grace smiled and said truth became complicated after enough time. But the lesson was true, the valley was real. They still used it. The principle of respecting what sustained you had kept them alive longer than anyone counted. Paul Redhawk worked with son Billy, teaching bow crafting. The process was meticulous, wood carefully selected and shaped. Paul explained a bow was more than a weapon. It was a tool extending capability, but only as good as the person using it. You needed strength, but also patience, focus, respect for what you were doing. Billy asked when he would be ready to hunt. Paul said when he understood hunting wasn't about killing, but about relationship. The animal gave its life so you could live. That was sacred. You honored it by making death quick and clean, using everything, never taking more than needed. This wasn't primitive superstition, Zalthor realized. It was sophisticated resource management wrapped in cultural practice. The spiritual framework ensured sustainable behavior across generations. Practical survival made sacred to ensure it was never forgotten. As day progressed, every interaction revealed layers of knowledge being passed down. Not just information, but wisdom. Children weren't being taught facts to memorize, but initiated into a way of seeing the world, understanding their place in it. Mary sat beside Dalvin during a quiet moment. She said he was trying to understand how they survived. He confirmed this, saying their baseline physiology didn't explain cold tolerance or endurance. Mary said that was because he looked at them wrong. He saw individuals, measured individual capability. But they didn't survive as individuals, they survived as a people. She gestured around the shelter. Grace's wisdom, John's leadership, Paul's skills, Daniel's knowledge, even Lucy's joy keeping spirits up, all of it together made them strong enough. Those soldiers died because they were trained to be independent, self-reliant, every man for himself. These people were trained that they were only as strong as the weakest among them, that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's. That made them something more than the sum of their parts. Dalvin struggled with the concept, but Zalthor understood. The Galactic Survey Corps measured species by individual capabilities. These humans had developed collective survival strategy that multiplied individual strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. It was elegant and sophisticated, developed by people most galactic civilizations would dismiss as primitive. Dawn broke clear and brilliant, sky-stunning blue that seemed impossible after days of gray violence. Temperature had dropped even further without wind to drive cold into bone and flesh, but humans emerged from shelters with visible relief. Commander Zalthor's suit registered temperatures that would be instantly fatal to most species. Yet humans moved about their tasks, breath steaming in crystalline air, apparently unbothered. John Whitefeather stood at camp's edge, surveying the transformed landscape. Snow had drifted into massive sculptures, some taller than shelters. The world was white and pristine, beautiful in its severity. This was what the soldiers saw, John said as Zalthor joined him. All this beauty, they thought it meant peace, that surviving the storm meant they had won. He shook his head. But the storm was just the beginning. After came the real test. The storm was violent but honest. You knew you were in danger. This seduced you, made you think the threat had passed. But cold was deeper now, resources scarcer, animals dug in, plants buried deeper. This was when mistakes killed you. Paul Redhawk emerged from checking horse shelter, his expression grim. Lost one, he said. The gray mare, her heart gave out during the night. A moment of silence passed through camp as news spread. The Krillians expected grief, perhaps anger. Instead, humans moved into action with somber efficiency. Grace Blackbird spoke formally. They honored the mare's service. She had carried supplies that helped them survive. Now she would keep them alive in another way. The practicality was jarring to the aliens, but watching humans work, they saw respect behind pragmatism. The horse was processed with care, every part utilized, prayers spoken over the body. Nothing wasted, everything honored. Dalvin observed that humans seemed less emotional than their data suggested. Mary Strongheart corrected him. They felt deeply, but feelings didn't change reality. That mare was gone. They could mourn her and starve, or mourn her and survive. She would want the second. Any creature that helped you live deserved the honor of its life, meaning something. Horse meat was preserved immediately, cold itself acting as refrigeration. Hide would become leather. Bones would become tools and glue. Even in death, the animal contributed to tribal survival. With immediate crisis addressed, humans began work of digging out. Paths needed clearing, shelters checked for damage, supplies assessed. It was exhausting labor, and the Krillians offered to help. Kate Strongheart showed Krental how to use snow shovel effectively. "Don't muscle it," she instructed. "You'll wear yourself out. Use your legs, keep your back straight, pace yourself. Snow doesn't care how strong you are if you're too tired to keep working." The 11-year-old girl was teaching a trained Krillian warrior about efficient labor. Krental listened and learned. Within an hour, he was moving snow with steady rhythm of humans, conserving energy for the long haul. Dalvin helped Mary and Grace process horsehide. His manipulators were different from human hands, but he proved adept. "This process would take minutes with proper equipment," he observed. "And require equipment we don't have," Grace replied. "This takes longer but works every time. Never breaks down, never needs parts we can't make ourselves. Sometimes simple is superior." Midday brought meal of hot soup and bread. Humans ate efficiently, refueling for more work. Billy Redhawk sat with Dalvin, peppering him with questions about other worlds. "Are there places where it never gets cold?" Billy asked. "Many worlds," Dalvin confirmed. "Some are warm enough that water never freezes." "Would be nice to visit," Billy said thoughtfully. "But I think I would miss winter." Sounds strange, but winter makes you appreciate warmth, makes summer feel like a gift. If everything was easy all the time, how would you know you were strong? How would you test yourself? This philosophy, spoken casually by a 10-year-old boy, encapsulated something profound about human psychology. They didn't just endure hardship, they derived meaning from it, used it to define themselves and measure their worth. Comfort wasn't their goal, growth was. Afternoon brought different work. John and Daniel checked trap lines they had set before the storm. Krental went with them, learning yet another survival skill. The traps were ingenious in their simplicity, using natural materials and animal behavior to catch small game. One had a rabbit frozen but intact. Daniel reset the trap with practice motions. John explained that hunting was uncertain, required time and energy you might not have, but traps worked while you did other things. Set a dozen traps and odds were good at least one would catch something. It was insurance, spreading your bets against starvation. Krental asked how they knew where to place traps. Daniel pointed to subtle signs, tracks in snow, droppings, chewed bark, paths worn by repeated passage. Animals were creatures of habit. They used the same routes, fed in the same places. You learned to read the land, see where animals would be, put your traps there. It took time to learn, but once you knew, you always knew. Back at camp, Grace was teaching Lucy and Kate how to work porcupine quills, dyeing them with natural colors and sewing them onto leather in decorative patterns. The work required patience and steady hands, each quill carefully positioned. It was beautiful, but Zalthor wondered about its practical purpose. Grace explained without him asking, as if reading his thoughts. "Beauty mattered," she said. "When you lived hard lives in hard places, beauty reminded you that life was worth living. These patterns told stories, marked important events, connected them to ancestors who did the same work. It was history you could wear, culture made visible. Also," she added with a smile, "it gave hands something to do during long winter nights, kept minds occupied when darkness and cold could make you feel trapped and hopeless. Making beautiful things was its own form of survival, feeding the spirit when the body was already fed." Evening brought another communal meal, this time including fresh rabbit meat from the trap. The portions were small, but everyone got some. Lucy noticed and asked why they didn't save it for people who worked hardest. Grace's answer was immediate. Everyone contributed in their way. Everyone deserved equal share. The moment you started deciding who deserved more, you created divisions that could tear the group apart. Unity was survival. Paul brought out his instrument again, but this time Billy asked to try. The boy's fingers were clumsy at first, but Paul guided him patiently, showing him where to place his hands, how to draw the bow across strings. The sound was rough but recognizable, a simple melody that made people smile. This too was teaching, passing down not just survival skills but culture, connection, the things that made them more than just animals trying to stay alive. They were maintaining humanity in the face of conditions that stripped life to its essentials. As night fell, Zalthor found himself thinking about the soldiers who died here. They had equipment, training, supplies. What they lacked was this, the intangible things that made survival possible, the unity, the shared purpose, the cultural knowledge passed through generations. the understanding that individuals were weak, but communities were strong. The soldiers had been trained to conquer. These people were trained to belong. The fifth day brought work in earnest. With storm past and sun shining, humans attacked the massive job of ensuring their survival through the rest of winter. Zalthor watched them divide tasks without discussion, everyone knowing their role through long practice and mutual understanding. A group led by Paul and Daniel headed out to check on cached supplies they had hidden before the worst weather hit. Another group under Mary's direction worked on repairing shelter damage from the storm. John supervised inventory, carefully noting what they had and calculating what they would need to make it through to spring. The Krillians tried to help, but found themselves more hindrance than aid. Their suits and physiology not designed for this kind of sustained physical labor. In extreme cold, Kate Strongheart, with the brutal honesty of children, suggested they might be more useful staying in camp and keeping fires going. It wasn't meant as insult, just practical assessment. So Zalthor found himself tending fires under Grace Blackbird's instruction, learning the subtle art of maintaining heat without wasting precious fuel. It was humbling for a starship commander to take direction from an elderly human woman, but also educational. Grace knew more about practical survival than his entire crew combined. She explained that fire was life but also danger. Too hot and you wasted wood you might need later. Too cool and you risked hypothermia. The trick was finding balance. Reading the fire like you read weather or animals, understanding what it needed and when. Different conditions required different approaches. Dry cold needed less fuel than wet cold. Windy days required more protection for flames. Night fires were managed different from day fires. Dalvin was helping Billy Redhawk process the rabbit from yesterday's trap. The science officer had dissected countless specimens in his career, but never as part of food preparation. Billy showed him how to remove the hide without damaging it, how to clean the carcass, save organs that were edible, use bones that would become tools. Nothing was wasted, Billy explained. Waste was death. If you killed something, you honored that death by using everything. The rabbit gave its life so they could live. That meant treating it with respect, making sure its death served purpose. Billy spoke about this with such matter-of-fact seriousness that Dalvin found himself moved. The hunting party returned at midday with good news. The cached supplies were intact, buried deep enough that the storm hadn't touched them. They had several weeks of dried meat, roots, and preserved berries safely stored. John's face showed relief, though he was careful not to show too much optimism. Winter was long and anything could happen. Lucy and Kate were tasked with organizing the retrieved supplies, sorting everything by type and checking for any damage. The girls worked efficiently, their young hands quick and careful. They found one bag where moisture had gotten in, and immediately brought it to Grace's attention. The old woman examined the contents, separated what was still good from what had started to spoil, made decisions without hesitation. Krental asked why children were given such important responsibility. John's answer was simple. They needed to learn, and the best way to learn was by doing real work with real consequences. Protecting children from responsibility didn't prepare them for life. It just made them helpless. Here everyone contributed according to their ability, and ability grew through practice and trust. The afternoon brought visitors. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, coming slowly through the deep snow. The humans noticed immediately, tension rippling through the camp. John and Paul collected their weapons, not aggressively but carefully. Daniel positioned himself where he could watch the approaches. Everyone else continued working, but with heightened awareness. The riders were human, heavily bundled against cold. They called out greetings from a distance, hands visible and empty. John responded, his voice carrying authority. The riders explained they were trappers who had been caught by the storm in the mountains, had seen smoke from the camp, and came seeking shelter and trade. What followed was careful negotiation. The strangers were invited to camp's edge, but not into the shelters immediately. They dismounted and stood where they could be watched while John, Paul, and Daniel evaluated them. Questions were asked about where they came from, what they carried, what news they brought from other regions. The trappers carried furs and some trade goods. They were willing to exchange for food and information about conditions to the north. Grace examined their furs with an expert eye, testing quality, checking for signs of disease or poor handling. She nodded approval and negotiations proceeded. Salthor watched this interaction with fascination. There were no contracts, no written agreements, just verbal exchanges and mutual assessment of trustworthiness. Yet both sides seemed satisfied with the arrangement. The trappers would stay one night, share their furs in exchange for hot food and shelter, then move on in the morning. That evening, the camp was crowded with 3 extra people. But the humans adjusted without complaint. The trappers, rough men with weathered faces, were respectful of the camp's rules and customs. They shared news from other settlements, stories of how others had fared during the storm. Not everyone had been as fortunate. Some camps had lost people, livestock, supplies. One trapper, an older man named Henry Collins, spoke of a family found frozen in their shelter 30 miles south. They had run out of firewood, tried to burn furniture and clothing, but it wasn't enough. By the time help arrived, they were gone, parents and 3 children dead in their sleep as cold crept in. The camp fell silent at this news. Even the children understood the weight of it, how close death always was, how thin the margin between survival and tragedy. Grace spoke a prayer in the old language, others joined in. It was a moment of recognition that survival was never guaranteed, that respect was owed to those who lost the fight against winter. The trappers also brought news about the military. The government was planning another expedition to this region, more soldiers with better equipment, determined to establish presence here. The people listened but didn't seem worried. John said quietly that the land would teach the same lessons it always taught, that some people had to learn the hard way that conquest wasn't the same as survival. After the meal, Henry Collins asked about the aliens. He had noticed the Krillians, of course, hard to miss them in their suits. John explained they were visitors from the stars, here to learn about how people lived. Henry accepted this with the same pragmatic attitude he seemed to apply to everything, asking Dalvin a few questions about whether other worlds had winters. Dalvin explained that many worlds had seasonal variations, but few combined Earth's particular mix of temperature extremes, atmospheric conditions, and biological diversity. Henry nodded and said that made sense, that Earth seemed determined to kill everything on it, which probably explained why everything on it was so tough. The trappers left at dawn as promised, heading north with their new supplies and the information John had shared about conditions ahead. They left behind quality furs that would be used to repair and improve clothing. It was fair trade, both sides benefiting, the kind of exchange that required trust and mutual respect. With the trappers gone, life returned to routine. The humans continued their endless cycle of work, teaching, maintaining, preparing. Every day brought tasks that needed completion, knowledge that needed passing down, skills that needed practice. There was no rest because winter didn't rest. It just waited for mistakes. Salthor was beginning to understand the fundamental difference between his people and these humans. The Krillians had built civilization by controlling their environment, eliminating variables, making survival certain through technology. Humans had built their culture by accepting uncertainty, adapting to variables, making survival possible through resilience and community. Neither approach was wrong, but they produced very different results. The Krillians were powerful but somewhat fragile, dependent on systems and infrastructure. These humans were seemingly fragile, but actually incredibly robust, able to function with minimal resources in maximum hardship. He wondered what would happen when humans finally reached the stars, when they brought their particular brand of adaptable resilience to the wider galaxy. Other species had conquered their homeworlds through technology. Humans had conquered theirs through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. That mentality applied to space exploration would be formidable. The days began to blur together in a rhythm of work and survival. Commander Zalthor found himself falling into the camp's routine, waking with the humans, sharing their meals, participating in their tasks as much as his physiology allowed. His ship sent regular messages asking when the landing party would return, but Zalthor kept delaying, inventing reasons to extend their stay. The truth was, he didn't want to leave. Not yet, because every day revealed new layers of human complexity. These people who lived in hide shelters and worked with stone tools were teaching him things that centuries of advanced education hadn't covered. They were teaching him about strength that didn't come from technology, about survival that didn't depend on systems, about community that couldn't be programmed. Dalvin was equally reluctant to leave. his scientific mind racing to catalog and understand everything he observed. He had filled multiple data files with observations, recordings, analysis, and still felt like he was barely scratching the surface of what made these humans so remarkably adapted to their harsh environment. Krental surprised them both by expressing the same reluctance. The security officer had found unexpected fulfillment in learning practical skills from people who lived by those skills every day. His combat training seemed almost trivial compared to the everyday bravery required to survive winter on this plateau. On the 10th day since their arrival, John Whitefeather announced that weather conditions were favorable for the Krillians to return to their ship if they wished. The statement hung in the air, clearly an offer, not a demand. They were welcome to stay longer if they chose, but he understood they had duties elsewhere. Zalthor made a decision that would probably result in a reprimand from headquarters. He told John they would stay one more week, that there was still much to learn and understand. John nodded acceptance without surprise, as if he had expected this response. That afternoon, Grace Blackbird asked Zalthor to walk with her. Despite her age, she moved through the snow with sure steps, leading him to a spot overlooking the plateau. The view was spectacular, endless white broken by dark patches of forest, mountains rising in the distance under a sky so blue it seemed artificial. Grace stood silent for a long moment before speaking. She said the soldiers who died here had stood in this same spot, looked at this same view. They thought they were seeing emptiness, a wasteland to be conquered or abandoned. They couldn't see what was really here, the richness hidden under snow, the life waiting for spring, the beauty and harshness. She turned to Zalthor with eyes that seemed to see through his environmental suit to the being beneath. Your people see us as primitive, she said. You write that in your reports even when you try to be respectful. You measure advancement by machines and cities and travel between stars. By those measures, we are nothing. Zalthor started to protest, but Grace raised a hand. It's true and it's fine, she said. We don't need you to think we're advanced. We know what we are. We are people who survive when survival seems impossible. We are people who find joy in hardship, meaning in struggle, beauty in bleakness. We are people who understand that strength comes from connection, not isolation, that wisdom comes from listening, not talking, that survival comes from respect, not conquest. She picked up a handful of snow, let it sift through her fingers. When your people reach for the stars, you bring your machines and your certainty, and your need to control everything. That will take you far, probably farther than we can imagine. But someday you'll face something your machines can't fix, your certainty can't predict, your control can't manage. When that day comes, remember what you learned here. Remember that humans survived winter not by being stronger than it, but by being flexible enough to bend without breaking. Remember that we thrived not by conquering nature, but by becoming part of it. Remember that our technology is simple, but our understanding is deep, and sometimes depth matters more than sophistication. Zalthor found himself without words. Grace smiled and patted his arm with surprising gentleness. Come on, she said. We should get back before you freeze, and I have to explain to your ship why I let their commander turn into an icicle. That evening, Paul Redhawk performed a ceremony. Something he said was appropriate for visitors who had shown respect and willingness to learn. The whole camp gathered in the largest shelter, fire burning bright in the center. Paul sang in the old language, his voice strong and clear, while others provided harmony and rhythm. Zalthor didn't understand the words, but felt the meaning anyway. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, a ritual marking the Krillians' transition from outsiders to guests, from observers to participants. When Paul finished, he presented each Krillian with a small gift. For Zalthor, a knife with a bone handle carved with intricate designs. For Dalvin, a pouch containing seeds and dried plants. For Krental, a string like the one Lucy had used for her games, woven in a complex pattern. These gifts were more than objects. They were symbols. The knife represented leadership and responsibility for others' welfare. The seeds represented knowledge and the importance of preservation. The string represented connection and the strength found in community bonds. The Krillians were moved beyond their ability to express. In their culture, gift-giving was transactional, exchanges of equivalent value. These gifts asked nothing in return. They were simply acknowledgement of connection, of shared experience, of mutual respect. Billy Redhawk asked if the Krillians would tell stories about their worlds, about places they had seen and people they had met. Dalvin agreed readily. describing worlds of crystal cities and floating gardens, of species that lived underwater, and others that flew through gas-giant atmospheres, of civilizations millions of years old and discoveries that defied understanding. The humans listened with rapt attention, children wide-eyed with wonder, adults thoughtful and engaged. When Dalvin finished, Daniel Morningstar said quietly that the universe was bigger and stranger than he had imagined, and that was both terrifying and exciting. Lucy asked if they could visit someday, if humans would ever travel to those distant worlds. Dalvin looked at Zalthor before answering. He said yes, humans would definitely reach the stars eventually, that their adaptability and determination made it inevitable. When they did, the galaxy would be changed by their presence, probably in ways no one could predict. Other species had gone to space seeking resources or knowledge or expansion. Humans would probably go seeking challenge, looking for new tests of their capabilities, new environments to adapt to, new impossibilities to make possible. John Whitefeather laughed at that assessment, said it sounded about right. Humans were contrary creatures, he said, most content when they were fighting against odds, most alive when they were proving everyone wrong about what was possible. Winter taught that lesson over and over. "You're going to die," said the cold, and humans replied not today and meant it. The ceremony broke up into smaller conversations, groups forming and reforming as people talked and shared and connected. The Krillians found themselves at the center of attention, answering questions, asking their own, building relationships that had nothing to do with scientific observation and everything to do with genuine curiosity and friendship. Later, as the camp settled into sleep, Zalthor sat with John near the fire. The human leader was working on a piece of wood, carving it with patient strokes. He asked Zalthor what he would tell his people about what he had seen here. Zalthor considered carefully before answering. He said he would tell them the truth, that humans were far more formidable than anyone suspected, that their classification needed immediate revision, that any species that could thrive in these conditions while maintaining art and music and joy was not to be underestimated. He would tell them that when humans reached space, they would be a force to be reckoned with, not because of technology, but because of spirit. John nodded slowly, his hands never stopping their work. "Just remember," he said, "that we're not trying to be formidable. We're just trying to live good lives, take care of our families, honor our ancestors, leave something worthwhile for our children. If that makes us strong, it's a side effect, not a goal." That distinction seemed important to John, and Zalthor thought he understood why. Power sought for its own sake was dangerous, corrupting. Strength developed through purpose and community and connection was different, sustainable, aligned with values rather than opposed to them. These humans were strong because they had to be, not because they wanted to dominate anyone. The fire burned low, and John banked it for the night, covering coals so they would last until morning. Zalthor settled into his designated sleeping area, surrounded by humans who had become something more than research subjects. They were teachers, friends, examples of what sentient life could achieve when it refused to surrender to circumstance.